Hello, and thank you for joining us for COBA Conversations. My name is Jaylen Brown. I'm a third-year finance major, as well as the chair for the College of Business Student Ambassadors. As we've seen, the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and so many more have ignited the world into raising their voices against racism and hate. Today, we've invited Dr. Richard Lapchick to discuss and share his perspective on racism in American sports. Dr. Lapchick is a human rights activist, the chair of UCF's DeVos Sports Business Management, the director of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport, and the president of the Institute for Sport and Social Justice. So obviously, he's been really busy. We're glad to have you here, Dr. Lapchick.
Thank you, Jaylen. Happy to be here.
So this time we're living in is sadly not the first time in our nation's history that racism has been a topic of discussion. So Dr. Lapchick, can you tell us what made you want to get involved in civil rights when you started almost 60 years ago?
Well, I have to go way back to do that, Jaylen. I was a 5-year-old boy and looked outside my bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, where I was raised, and saw my father's image swinging from a tree with people under the tree picketing. And for several years after that, I'd pick up the extension phone in our house, my dad not knowing I was listening. And it was racial epithet after racial epithet being hurled at him. I didn't understand as a 5, 6, and 7-year-old what that meant, except that a lot of people didn't like my best friend in the world. I'd find out later that as the coach of the New York Knicks, he had signed the first African-American player in the history of the NBA, and there were a lot of people who were unhappy that he did that. Because he was a great player and a great coach, everybody expected me, including myself, to be a great NBA player. My dad was the first great big man in basketball. I was 6 feet tall in the 8th grade. I was heavily recruited and was offered a scholarship to go to a school called Power Memorial, which was the top basketball program in the country at the time. I didn't go there, but became friends with the coach who invited me to his summer camp the next year. Summer camps were really rare at that point in 1961. He had 5 of his white players and a black player there, and one of the white players was dropping the N-word on the black player pretty much nonstop for the first 3 days. I finally challenged him on the 3rd day. That guy knocked me out cold. The black guy's name at the time was Lou Alcindor, became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And a lifelong friendship began to the point where when they unveiled Kareem's statue at the Staples Center, he asked me to speak at it when Barack Obama was giving him his Presidential Medal of Freedom. I was one of his 2 personal guests, along with Henry Louis Gates of Harvard, to be his guest at the White House that day. And Kareem came here to be with me when I was scheduled to have surgery several years ago. He spoke at a UCF College of Business commencement a couple of years ago, and he taught Taco Fall his skyhook, which was an improvement in Taco's game, which is now flourishing in Boston. But what was important to me at the time was not the lifelong friendship. It was that I suddenly had a young urban African-American lens with which to watch and learn what was going on with racism in his community in New York City. And I committed myself to spending the rest of my life working on the area of civil rights. I really didn't know what it meant at that point, Jaylen, but I knew I was going to spend my life doing that. I went and got a PhD in international race relations and did my dissertation on how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy during the apartheid era, and compared it to how the Nazis used theirs in the 1930s. It was published as a book. I started speaking about apartheid. I ended up founding the sports boycott of South Africa in the mid-1970s. And the first South African team was coming to the United States in 1978. It was a Davis Cup tennis team that was going to play in the North American zone of the Davis Cup because nobody else would compete with them in Europe anymore because of apartheid. So my job as the head of the coalition of groups, and all the major civil rights organizations were in the coalition, was to go to Nashville to get the matches canceled. The African governments with whom I was working closely asked me to announce that they would boycott the Los Angeles Olympic Games in 1984 if this team was allowed to come. So we held a press conference at Vanderbilt right before I spoke to the Vanderbilt student body. I announced that. All 3 networks were there covering it because of the importance for the Olympics. Dick Schaap, who was then covering for NBC Nightly News, came up to me and he said it looked like the matches were going to be canceled. The corporate sponsor withdrew. And I announced that to the crowd. It was an anti-apartheid crowd. They went crazy. And when I flew home to Virginia, where I was teaching at the time, I thought maybe for the first time in my life I had done something worthwhile. The Next night, Jaylen, I was working in my college office, which was in the school's library. The library closed at 10:30. At 10:45, there was a knock on the door. I assumed it was the campus security. So I didn't hesitate to open the door, but on the other side, instead of campus security, it was two men wearing stocking masks who proceeded to cause liver damage, kidney damage, a hernia, concussion, and carve the N-word in my stomach with a pair of office scissors. That night, lying in a hospital, I reflected on my dad and myself, and I realized that if people had gone to the length they did to try to stop him 28 years before, and the length they went to that night to try to stop me, they must have felt we were having an impact on fighting racism in America. And I decided that I would spend the rest of my life using the sports platform to address various social justice issues, but especially the racial issue. And that's what I've done for the next, whatever that would be, 42 years.
Geez, that was inspirational. I didn't know you went through all of that. That's a lot.
It's quite a period, for sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, Dr. Lapchick, as I mentioned before, the topic of racism is definitely not new in the United States, but for some reason this time it does feel different. So for our next question, how do you think Gen Z is different compared to previous generations when faced with the injustice of racism?
I agree with you that it's different. I mean, I've lived through all of the killings during the civil rights era in the 50s and 60s and 70s and things that have happened since then. But I think what I read in those days was seeing still pictures of the horror and reading about it as opposed to actually watching a man die. Your generation and the millennials, I think, are more compassionate, more passionate, and care more about social justice than previous generations do. And that's one of the reasons I think this is different. You have the technology with smartphones and social media to capture things live and to communicate it more rapidly than we were able to in the past. And I think from my world, the world of athletes, we're seeing athletes be activists against racism in unprecedented ways in the history of sport in America. It's something I've worked to get athletes to do most of my life, but it's only recently happened that athletes have been able to stand up as a group and have that powerful voice raised. So I think this is a different period of time, and it's why I have hope that this might bring about real change.
So Dr. Lapchick, where do we start? And what kinds of reforms can be put into place to change these statistics to reach equal economic footing?
Well, you make a really strong point. This isn't just about police brutality. It's about systemic racism that's built into the system. People talk about fixing a broken system. I really believe that this system was constructed to do exactly what it's done, keep white people in power. This isn't just about police brutality. It's about systemic racism that's built into the system. People talk about fixing a broken system. I really believe that this system was constructed to do exactly what it's done, keep white people in power and concentrate all the wealth in the white community. And that's been done very effectively. An additional statistic for your listeners is that the income gap between white Americans and black Americans the wealth gap rather is greater than it was in South Africa between black and white South Africans during the height of apartheid. Apartheid was the system of government that literally every country in the globe came to try to bring down. This system in the United States has produced a similar aggregate wealth gap that is going to be very difficult to overcome, but I think it has to start there. It has to start by putting more money into communities of color for education, for health. It has to reform the criminal justice system. We are in the process of taking the laws off the books that have put so many black and brown people in prisons, where they're spending inordinate amount of time that when they come out, they may be able to have somewhat of a normal life, but when they go to an employer and the employer said, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And the answer is yes, that's usually going to be the end of the discussion. So this racism has to be addressed at every level, through every generation. A black child statistically will live a shorter life than babies born in India and Bangladesh. How is that possibly acceptable in what Donald Trump calls the greatest country on the face of the earth?
Good point. I do want to transition a little bit more into racism in American sports, because I know you're definitely an expert in that. And we also know that you're the director of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport, also known as TIDES. And this organization releases college, racial, and gender report cards, which is basically like a real report card us students receive with grades A through F, except it applies to major league organizations such as the NFL, NBA, MLB, and college sports. So Dr. Lapchick, can you tell us more about the college racial and gender report card and what areas it focuses on?
Well, each of the report cards focuses on literally every professional position in the organization, and it breaks down how many women are hired and how many people of color are hired. And the intent of it is to try to put pressure on leagues and colleges and universities, in the case of the college report card, to hire more women and people of color. And I think there's a perfect example of the importance of that in two relatively recent NFL and NBA examples. When the Ray Rice story was breaking in the NFL, which I consider has the best public relations machine in professional sport, Roger Goodell first said 2-game suspension, then 6-game suspension. The media nightmare was horrible. The reality was Roger Goodell didn't have a single senior woman administrator in the NFL league office with whom he could have consulted and who maybe would have said, this is not a problem of the NFL, Roger. Let's put it this way. You've had 54 athletes accused of gender violence since you became commissioner. In America, there were 11 million women battered in that period of time and 9 million raped. It's not a problem of the NFL. It's a problem of American men. Let's use our teams and our city franchises to address gender violence in each of those cities. He eventually hired 3 women late in the season, and that's exactly what they adopted. The media nightmare could have been avoided. Shortly before that, Adam Silver had just become commissioner of the NBA, which has the most diverse front offices and league offices in professional sports. And a tape is leaked late on a Friday night where the LA Clippers owner, Donald Sterling, is using racial epithets. And Adam goes to those leaders on his team, who are people of color and women, and asks their advice. And on Tuesday morning, he gets up in front of a podium and said what nobody expected him to say, including me. And I have a lot of faith in the NBA and Adam Silver. He said, we have no space for a racist owner in this league. We are taking away the ownership of the LA Clippers from Donald Sterling. Nobody had ever sanctioned an owner before, but he had those diverse voices. Goodell didn't have those diverse voices. So if you're going to get A's, that means you're going to have a better organization. If you're not going to get A's, you're going to have an organization that's not going to be as effective.
Okay, makes enough sense. And personally, I hope that one day all organizations will strive for that A grade in gender and racial equality. But this actually leads into how organizations can change their report card grades. And we've seen many athletes, organizations, and coaches take a stand against racism. And you've actually mentioned this before in your previous point. And we also know that you've been consulting with many major league teams across the country, including College of Business Hall of Famer Brian Wright, who's the manager of the San Antonio Spurs, on how teams can fight racism through their organizations. So, Dr. Lapchick, how do sports organizations go about fostering a sense of acceptance between those who want to protest visually against racism, such as bending the knee? And does this stance differ with athletes at the collegiate level?
Well, I think the door is wide open now as a result of the murders that have recently taken place. I think you're going to see athletes speaking up on college campuses. I speak on a lot of college campuses, usually brought there by the athletic department. The most frequent requests I get is to help advise them on how to structure athlete activism so it's done in a positive way. But right now, I think there's so much anger and frustration in the United States that we're just going to see athletes demanding action and taking action. And I think we're going to see one of the things that encourages me right now is I think white people are listening more than they have in the past. If you look at the demonstrations, there are more white people in the demonstrations than I've ever seen before.
Definitely.
I think we're trying to learn. And, Jaylen, at the time of the attack, a lot of people said to me, well, now you know what it's like to be Black. And my answer to them always was, I really don't, because I could walk away from this cause at any moment and rejoin the white middle class and never face discrimination again. If I was Black, I would face discrimination every day of my life. So there's no way that I can totally understand. I might be empathetic and hopefully am, but to completely understand that, you have to be somebody who has Black skin or brown skin.
All right. Dr. Lapchick, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to answer our questions. And I definitely think you made an impact for the students who are watching this.